A lot of times what happens when you're editing here in Lightroom, you can go overboard really easily with the clarity filter. You can always tell when someone uses it a little too heavily. So I always add just a little bit, and then I go in and I selectively add a little bit more. Now, once I do my basic edits in Lightroom, the only other thing that I do here is if I need to, I edit my noise reduction. And some of your images may need this depending on the ISO that you shot with. I shot with an ISO of 100, so it's not going to make a difference for me, but I always suggest that you do your noise reduction in Lightroom first. Now, once I've got my basic edits done, this is when I'm going to go into Perfect Effects. So I've got my image, and I'll just right click on it, go to Edit In, and then I'll choose Perfect Effects from here. Now, the best part about going through this Edit In menu is when I go to Perfect Effects, it opens up this dialog box, and this is a raw file. So this is straight out of my camera. I've done absolutely nothing to it. It will automatically select this option right up here at the top when you're editing raw photos. It's called Edit a Copy with Lightroom Adjustments. And this allows you to go in and make sure that you never edit your original image. So I'm not going to be editing a raw file. I'm going to be editing a copy of my image. So I'll always have that original photo if I want to. And then underneath, I've got my Copy File Options dialog box. And this allows me to choose what type of file I want. And this is actually really beneficial, particularly if you're going to be doing any compositing work, if you know that you're going to want to be bringing this into Photoshop for whatever reason, if you want to bring it into Perfect Layers and you need to play around with some of those tools. I like to save it as a PSD file so I have access to the layer stack if I ever want it. So once I have my file all ready to go, that's when I'll go ahead and click on Edit. And it'll pop me into Perfect Effects. And that's where we're going to go ahead and start today. Now, inside Effects, on the left-hand side, this is where the effects library is. And this is where you're going to see all of the different categories of effects that you can play around with. I typically like to start with a couple of different presets. I make a lot of presets. It's typically how I work inside of Perfect Effects, but I want to kind of show you how to build your own preset. So for this image, we've got a whole bunch of things that we need to start with. And number one is definitely going to be, we want to edit the brightness. We want to make sure that everything in this image is correct as far as exposure goes. So we'll go ahead and open up the brightness category, and you'll see I've got a whole bunch of different options here. The first one that I want to add is going to be called Highlights Darker. I want to drop the highlights where the clouds are so that I have more information there. And when I'm working in effects, I always like to go through and do basic edits first. So I want to go in and I want to drop the highlights a little bit. Now, the best part about working with the brightness category is on the right-hand side, when you add an effect, it pops up this effect options pane. And this is really cool because it allows you to basically continue editing this effect if you need to. So you'll see I've got a couple of basic sliders here. We've got my highlight slider, which allows me to darken those highlights, and it's all the way up to 50. So I can play around with that if I want to. I'm going to go down probably quite a ways to about 60 or 75. I'm going to drop those clouds down quite a bit. Now, instead of just leaving it at that, I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to make a couple other edits here. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to add a little bit of local contrast, which kind of pumps everything up and gives it a little bit more of that HDR styling to it. I might pump up my clarity here if I want to kind of finish off some of those edges. I may lighten it just a little bit more, just to kind of pump up the exposure just a tad, because it is getting a little dark. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to add some contrast. So all I had to do was basically add a tone enhancer option, and it automatically goes in and it allows me to add some extra effects if I want to, all without having to go in and add multiple layers here. Now, once I've gone through and I've made all of these changes, I want to add something on top of this. The next thing we need to do, once we've fixed the exposure and it's exactly what I want, I need to go in and I need to fix the color, because the color in this image is really dull. The after image was so much brighter and so much more exciting, and this was exciting when I was there. I was almost getting washed away by the tide, so that was exciting. But it was a lot more colorful while I was there. And so I need to punch back in some of that color and possibly enhance it a little bit more. So we'll go in and click on the Add button, and it gives me an empty layer right here. And now I can add another effect on top of it. And this is the best way to work with effects, is stacking multiple things together, because you're never just going to add one effect. Most of the time, you're going to end up adding multiple effects. And that's typically how it works inside Perfect Effects, is you add multiple things together to kind of make your own. So on the left-hand side, we're going to go ahead and go down to the contrast or the color correction category. We've got two here. I'll open up color correction, and you'll see we've got some basics like auto color. We've got some tonal ones like cool shadows, so it'll cool down all of your shadows. Now I'm just going to go down and I'm going to select increase color right here. So we'll go ahead and click on that, and it just pumps everything up a little bit. Now on the right hand side, again, it gives me the option of editing this a little bit more if I want to. So all I need to do is take the saturation of this layer and continue pumping it up until the colors start to resemble something a little bit more vibrant like I remember. So we'll just go up probably to about 20 or 30. Now the best part about being in this effect options pane right here is now I can continue editing it if I want to. So I can do things like edit the temperature or the tint. So if I want to cool the image down a little bit, I can go in and do that. I can also go in and I can change the hue and the lightness. So for now, I'm just going to pump up that color and I'm going to leave it be. Again, we'll go in and we'll click on that add button one more time. We'll go ahead and click add, and we've got an empty layer. And then we'll go back over to the left-hand side and we're back in our effects library. And the next thing that I really want to do is I need to change some of the colors a little bit. The colors themselves are not correct. And this is something that happens when you shoot in a lot of cloudy weather. You'll notice that a lot of times, even when it says that it's balanced as far as your image goes, the colors still look a little off, or you don't necessarily like the way they look in an image. So I always like to go down to the landscape category. And this is a whole bunch of pre-packaged landscape specific effects. And these can be a great place to start if you're working with effects or working with landscapes and effects. So let me scroll down and I'll show you, we've got a whole bunch of different, they're called the magic presets, and they work really well depending on the type of landscape that you're editing. So we've got magic city, got magic desert, magic forest, right down here is magic ocean, and then underneath is magic sunset. And we've got a whole bunch of other ones in here that we can play around with. But a lot of times what I like to do is start with one of these and see how they look. So I'll just go ahead and select magic ocean, and we'll apply it. And I'm starting to like the way it's looking a little bit more. It pumped up some of that color. It pumped up a little bit of the clarity back in there. So it's adding more contrast to those edges. Now, once we've applied that, the next thing I need to do is I need to add some blue in. And usually when you're working in effects, and I'm talking through this pretty quickly, when you're working through effects, most of the time I go through and I just experiment. So I click and I add a layer, I take a look at what I'm doing, and I kind of go to one step at a time. So I edited the lightness, I increased the color, I added kind of a basic landscape filter that pumped up some of the blues and the contrast a little bit more. And now I want to keep continuing to do that. And this is typically how I work inside Perfect Effects, because a lot of times when you're working in here, you want to just play around. This isn't a serious program. It isn't something that you need to be diehard about. I mean, you can be, but that's typically not how I work. I like to play around. So for this image, I might want to go back in and reduce kind of the there's like a haloing effect that's right around some of the rocks here. I might want to go in and reduce that. But for now, I'm just playing around and I'm trying to figure out what's going to work with this image. So the next thing I need to do is I need to blue up a whole bunch of the photo. So I'm going to go to my search option bar up at the top, and I'm just going to go ahead and type in a word. So if I know that I want to cool it down, I could type in cool and see what pops up. And we've got cooling filters, cooling textures. We've got a brush in effect that allows you to brush in coolness. We've got cool shadows here. So I'm actually going to go ahead and stick with, let's go ahead and do cool shadows. Now, you'll see that whenever you type in a word, it's going to pop up everything. So it's going to pop up stuff from my vintage category, from those texture categories, from other categories. So let me go up and let's actually use this cooler one. So we'll go ahead and click on that effect. It applies it to the entire image. Now the next thing that I need to do is edit it out of parts of my image. So I need to remove it from all of the rocks. I don't like the way that that looks. So I'll go over and select my brush tool now. And once I've got my brush tool selected, I can go in and I can literally paint out where I don't like the effect. So I'm just clicking and dragging over these rocks. And I'm not getting too close to the edge just yet because I'm going to turn my perfect brush on in just a minute. So a lot of times I like to go in and I kind of edit out the bulk of where I want to remove the effect. So we're just kind of getting it off of most of the rocks. And then we'll go in and we'll get a little bit more specific in just a minute. Now once we've done the bulk, I'm going to go up and I'm going to turn my perfect brush on. And this is our edge detection brush. And this is what it does is it pays attention to color and tone underneath the center of the brush. You'll see that crosshair that's right in the middle of my brush. This is where it's going to be sampling information from. So we'll just click and drag over the edge of this rock, and it's leaving everything else alone, like the ocean, and it's only affecting the rock. And so this is typically how I like to go through when I'm working with a mask, is I do it's kind of like color in the lines you did in like kindergarten. You always kind of start with the center and you scribble it in, and then you get to do the outline first. You can do it the outline first and then scribble it in. Just depends on what you like to do. So we'll go through and we'll edit out all of that coolness on the rock so that I don't have to deal with that anymore. And now I've got this nice blue water and I've got these nice warm rocks. And my image is starting to look a lot better. When I turn this cooler layer on and off, here's my original image, which is really dull and really green. And then here's with that cooling filter on. It's adding a lot of intense blues into that background. Now, I'm going to go ahead and take the amount slider of this layer and I'm going to move that down to the left a little bit. It's a little too intense for this image. I don't want it to look exceptionally fake. We're already pushing that line just a little bit with that magic ocean, which really pumped up the contrast, the tonal contrast in there. So I want to lower that down just a little bit. Now, the next thing that's really, really cool about Perfect Effects is I can reuse the mask that I just created. So I added a mask on top of these rocks here to just edit the background, and I want to continue doing that. So I'm just going to go up to my mask menu and select copy mask, and now I can reuse that later if I want to. So we'll go ahead and add one more layer here, and I'm going to go over and we'll go ahead and turn that off, and I want to add a warming filter. And this will make more sense in just a minute, I promise, because we just cooled down the entire area, so why would we warm it up? Well, there's secrets, super secrets, that are super cool inside Perfect Effects. So we'll go ahead and just type in the word warm, and we'll see what pops up. We've got warming filters here. We've got graduated warm filters. We've got all of these different warm style filters here, and I really like these. So I'm going to go in and let's see. Let's go up and I'm just going to add a basic warming filter. Go ahead and click on that. Now, obviously this doesn't look right on my entire image. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to my mask menu and choose paste mask. Go ahead and paste that in, and now it's only affecting the sky. Now that's a step in the right direction. The next thing that I need to do is selectively choose even more where I want this to affect my image. So if I go over, I have an options pane here in Perfect Effects, and this is something that can be really, really useful. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the options pane, and it pops open here. This allows me to change things like blending mode, which is very important depending on the style of the effect that you're adding, or the apply effect to drop down menu. And this is what I'm going to be using. This allows you to choose what part of your image that's been broken down into highlights, midtones, or shadows, or different color channels. Choose which part of your image you want to apply an effect to. So for this photo, I want to only apply it to the highlights. And it's going to look really, really weird. Like it looks super weird right now, but just go with me for a second. Once I have it selected, I'm only applying this to my highlights. You'll see it's adding the effect to the tops of the waves, and it's adding it to a whole bunch of the clouds up in the sky. Now what I want to do to soften the effect is take my fuzziness slider, and I want to move that over to the right to soften the edge. So we'll just keep on going over to the right, and you'll see it's blending that warmth into the highlights of the sky, but it's leaving a lot of the blues of the midtones and the shadows here in the surf and in the mountains in the back and in the sky. It's leaving all of that alone. And this is a function that a lot of people don't use very often, and it always makes me sad because it is such a really cool feature. Now, I'm going to go ahead and click apply, and then I'm just going to go over to my amount slider and we're going to lower that down a little bit. I just want a bit of a soft warmth coming through the sky. I don't want it to be overboard, but it kind of, it brings a slightly different effect to that sky. It makes it look a little bit more interesting without it just being kind of this slate boring blue. We don't want it to be boring. Now, the last thing that I would do with this image is save this as a preset. So I've gone in and I've spent a whole bunch of time adding multiple layers together. We did some basic highlights, shadows, and local contrast edits. We increased the color, we added the magic ocean layer, and then we cooled down the sky and warmed up the highlights. And now I'm ready to go. I'm finished with my image. I want to export it and finish it. But before I do that, I want to save this as a preset so that I can reuse this again later. So we'll go to the preset menu and choose Save Preset. I'll go ahead and type in a name. We'll call it Liz's Ocean Preset. And usually I like to give it a pretty good name so I can kind of remember what it actually is. When I open it up, you'll see I've got a whole bunch of preset categories in here. And I have a separate one that's just for landscape presets. And if you work with a lot of presets, this is a great way to do things inside effects. So we'll go ahead and choose Landscape Presets, type in my name, and we'll go ahead and click Create. Now, once I'm done with this preset, I can go over to my presets menu, and these are where all the presets lie. These are where the ones that you either download or already have and made yourself. This is where they're going to be. And you can create, you'll see, again, I've got a ton of categories in here. So I have ones that are specific to vintage film stylings that I've gone through and created. I've got ones that I've almost specifically just used for portraits. I've got this like 1970s film style portrait that I use a lot. So I have these portrait presets in here. I've got a couple that I've taken from friends. And then right up at the top, here's my landscape presets. And I've got a whole bunch already in here. I've got blue skies, which you'll see intensifies the blues in the image. If I scroll down, I've got some landscape presets with borders, if I know I need to add a border. Here's my ocean preset. Here's another ocean preset that I had created, which is actually really cool and kind of similar to the one that I had just made. So presets are a great way to work inside effects because they can be so much fun and they can add such a great touch to your image. And they're really easy to use. So it's really, really fun. If you keep saving your presets and reuse them, you can always go back in and edit them later. So if it doesn't work with a certain image, you can do that. Now, one of the things that I realize a lot of people don't do, I'm done with this entire image. I'm going to go ahead and click the apply button. And a lot of times I've noticed that in webinars that I know I've done or presentations that people have seen, no one ever actually presses the apply button. And this is a large image. This is a PSD file straight from a RAW file. So this is going to be a big image and it might take a minute. And I'm probably going to talk about other things while this is happening and answer some questions. But I want to show you guys what happens when you go from effects back into Lightroom because it's something that people don't usually see. So while this is loading, I'm going to go through and answer a couple of questions here. And let's see what we've got. So let's see. Does saving a preset keep the masks that were created? Does it make sense that a particular mask is saved? So we do not save the masks that are part of a preset. And the reason why is every time that you add something to a new image, if you add a preset to a new image, you're going to always want to go in and reapply a mask because every photo is going to be different. So we always make sure that we delete that mask so you can go in and you can individually add it depending on the photo. So the masks are not saved. It looks like there are a whole bunch of questions about whether you can view this later. I am recording this webinar, so if you guys want to watch it later or unfortunately have to go, you always have the option of rewatching it. We'll be getting it up on YouTube. I'll make sure that I usually cut out the intro so that it's not me telling you guys that the microphones are off. So I'll go in and cut out the intro and we'll put it up on YouTube either today or tomorrow. So if you guys missed anything, you'll always be able to go back and rewatch these, which is really great. Now, if you save a preset, there's also a question, if you save a preset, can you modify it later? You can't go, so once I've gone back into Lightroom, I can't go back in and modify each layer of that preset, which is why I always save everything as a preset. If I don't like what happened here, if I need to go in and edit the halo that's right around this rock, which I probably would if this was something that was going to go up on my website, if I was going to put this up there, I would probably go back in and want to erase that halo. But I was trying to get stuff done pretty quickly, so I wanted to show you how everything worked. I would go back in and just reapply that preset and then tweak it again. And this is why I recommend that you save everything that you ever do in Effects, because presets don't take up a lot of space. They take up next to no space whatsoever. So saving 100 presets, which is probably close to what I have on my work computers and my studio computer, doesn't require a lot of space. And it always gives you the option of going back in and saying, you know, I didn't really like that. I want to go back in and edit it. But here inside of Lightroom, I can't go in and edit that preset. This has been saved back into Lightroom, and I've got my library open right here. And you'll see this is the image that we just edited. And it's in a stack with my original image. So I always have access to my original photo. Here's my photo right here. This is what it started out with, straight from the camera, basic Lightroom adjustments. And then this is what we just created inside Perfect Effects. So it's really great because when you save back into Lightroom, you have basically a stack of your images here. And you can always go in and you can play around with these and you could edit them. But if you want to go back into Effects, you'll have to basically start from scratch again. So it doesn't save those layers so that the next time you go into Effects, you can tweak all of them. That would end up being a lot more space that's saved into your image. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so I want to go ahead and I want to move on because there's a whole bunch of other stuff that is worth talking about. I want to talk to you about Perfect Layers and Perfect Mask and a little bit of basic compositing through Lightroom. So let me go ahead and crush those images really quick. And I'm going to do a really basic masking image, mostly so that I can talk to you about layers and layering with Lightroom. So forgive me for using a pretty simple image, but it's going to work a lot better so I can show you a lot of the options that you have inside of Perfect Mask and Perfect Layers. So let me scroll down and we'll get a pretty simple photo here. Now, when you're working with an image where you want to remove a sky, this sky is ridiculously boring and I need something that has a lot more information to it because it just doesn't, it is really boring. If you live somewhere like I do, I live in Oregon, and there is no sky here. It's almost July and it's still raining here. It's just cloudy and gray and awful. So I replace a lot of skies, as do most of the people who live probably in Oregon. So for this image, I want to go in and I want to replace the sky. And I have two different options for how to do that. I can select one of my own. I have three different options. I can select one of my own here inside of Lightroom. I can select one in layers of my own, or I can select one in layers of ours. So the first thing I want to do is show you how to bring another image into Lightroom. So I've got my photo selected right here. And let's scroll up, and I've got a couple images that have some nice skies. So I really like the sky that's in this image right here. It obviously has a bottom part to it, but the sky itself is really nice. I really like this. So to add this as a sky, I'll just select this image, hold down the Command key on a Mac or the Control key on a PC, and select my other image. And once I've got them both selected, all I'm going to do is go up to the File menu, go down to Plugin Extras, and choose Perfect Layers from there. Now, it's going to export both of these photos, and inside Layers, it's going to add them as a layer stack. So we have my photo layer right here with the bride sprawled out on top of it's called the Heart of Glass image, and it's a photo that has a really nice background. So what I want to do is shrink down this Heart of Glass layer so that it fits better with my bride layer. So to do that here, we have a transform tool, and the transform tool, we'll go ahead and select it, and it selects my entire my entire image here, and I can go through and we'll go ahead and just resize it. Now the heart of glass image is a lot larger than my bride image, and you can tell that just by that transparent background. And this is something that you'll see when you're working with images. So we'll go ahead and size that down. Now I've got all of this excess. And what do you necessarily do with it? So what I do is I take the top layer, got my bride layer, and I'm going to go up to my crop tool. And what's really cool about the crop tool is in the top right-hand corner, it has a fit to layer button. So we'll go ahead and click on that, and it'll fit my crop box to my photo layer, and then I'll go ahead and click apply. And now it's gone through and it's cropped my image down. I've already resized my heart of glass layer, so I'm good to go. So it's really, really easy to go through and just crop your image back down. And it didn't cut any of the size from this bride layer, and I didn't necessarily have to worry about cutting size down from my background layer. So it's really easy to crop and quickly get rid of excess inside of layers. So you always have the option of being able to do that here. Now I've got my brand new background layer, but let's say I don't like it. I've added it in and I think it's kind of boring and it doesn't necessarily fit with this image. I have two different ways that I can add another layer here inside of Perfect Layers. So let me go ahead and just delete this photo layer, and I need to add in a new background. So on the left-hand side, this is my desktop. This is my computer desktop. This is what anyone's going to see when they're working with their images. I'm going to go ahead and let's open up the Photos folder here. Now I'm going to show you really quickly the Quick View browser. So I'll go ahead and open the Quick View browser, and this is new with 7.5. When you go ahead and click on that button that's to the right of any of these folders, it opens it up inside a full screen view. And these are landscapes, portraits, these are textures that I've shot, and then there's wedding pictures down here as well. So I've got all of my different categories here of photos on my desktop. So we'll go ahead and open up the landscapes category, and we'll scroll through, and we've got a whole bunch of images with some pretty awesome skies in the back. And when you're working, what's really cool is when you're working with your own images, you can use a photo that has a sky in it. So this image right here, I really like this sky. It has a bottom part to it, but it won't matter because we're only going to be showing the sky. So it's really nice. You can use any style of image that you want as a sky. It doesn't matter whether there's information there or not. So I want to go through and I want to use, let's go back up and I'll use that really cool kind of night sky layer here. So all I need to do to add this image is just click on it once. I'll add it as a brand new layer. And now I've got my brand new sky. All I do is just click and drag it into place. So now here's my photo. It's not my photo, it's Brian Matiash's photo, but here's a photo off of my desktop that I added in as my brand new background. So that's how you would add your own photos. Now, if you don't have one necessarily, we also have the extras category here on the left-hand side. And this allows you to go in and add one of the backgrounds that we already include in the suite. So we'll go ahead and open up the backgrounds category. And you'll see there's a skies category. Let me open up that Quick View browser so I can actually see all of these. These are all of the prepackaged skies that come with the suite. So if there's anything in here that you want to use, you have complete access to it, and you can use anything that you want. So I'm going to go ahead and select this sky layer, and again, I'll just click on it once. We'll add it as a brand new layer, and there we go. If I need to, I can always resize this layer just by using the transform tool. And once I've got my transform tool all set, I can click on my fill button and it sizes this background layer to my image size. And this can be really helpful if you're working with backgrounds. Now, the next thing I want to do is I'm going to spread it out just a little bit, and I want to move it up to where the actual sky is. I want some of those smaller clouds that are there right down at the bottom. So we'll go ahead and put that in place, click on apply, and now we'll just drag it underneath my photo layer. So this is going to be my brand new sky layer. Delete my strange sky. So we've got my sky all selected and I'm ready to go. This is when I'm going to go into Perfect Mask. You always want to start out inside Perfect Layer, setting up your layer stack before you go into Mask. So now I'll go ahead and click on Mask. And it'll pop me in here. Now for this image, it's going to be really easy. I'm just going to use something called the drop brush tool. And this is just telling the computer what colors of the image I want to drop out. So all I need to do is just click and drag, and it's going to remove the bulk of my image. Now, if it goes a little overboard, and if you're having problems with Perfect Mask, when you're using the drop brush tool, you have two different options for refining the colors that you remove from your image. And this is, again, something that a lot of people don't necessarily know when it comes to Perfect Mask, is if you lower down the segment size, so we'll go down to like 2 or 3, and then if you lower your refine number, what that does is it pays closer attention to the colors that you want to remove. So in this image, I'm only removing blues, but let's say this had some clouds in it. If I want to be very specific about the colors that I get rid of, and I maybe want to leave some of the clouds in there, this will allow me to take a more specific color sample from my photo. So we'll just click and drag this time, and we'll try it again. And now that I've done that, you'll see it left a little bit more information in her face, and that's good. That's exactly what we want. Now, once we've gotten rid of our background, we'll go ahead and click on Apply, and it's going to pop me back into Perfect Layers. And there's obviously something wrong with this background. It's exceptionally obvious that this was a background that was added in. And you'll see in my Layers palette, I've got my new image with the sky taken out, and I've got this brand new sky. However, it looks ridiculous, unfortunately. It looks really ridiculous because it's completely in focus. You can see all the edges of the clouds, but the background here is not, it doesn't look very good. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to add a little bit of blur filter to this background here. So I've got my sky layer selected. I'm going to go up to focal point. Right up here, it's called focus, and we'll go ahead and click on that. And I have my sky layer selected here. And when I have my sky layer selected, I'm going to go in, and you'll see, even though this is technically over the top part of my image where the actual bride and the rocks are, it's only affecting my background layer. And this is really, really great if you're doing a lot of heavy editing here inside of Focal Point or any of the other programs. You have separate access to using all of these different filters on separate layers. And this is really, really useful. So it doesn't matter what style of focal bug I'm going to use. I'm just moving it down here so that the focal point is down here and the background is going to be nice and blurred. And that's all that really matters here. So it doesn't matter whether this is planar or round. I'm just dropping it below the sky so that all of this back here is going to get nice and blurry. So I'm just going to go up and play around with my feathering amount, and we'll play out with my blur amount if I want to blur it even more. I'm starting to like that effect a little bit. I don't want to go overboard because it'll start to look a little fake. So we'll go down just a tad. I can play around with things like highlight bloom, contrast, and so on here. So we'll do highlight bloom to kind of pump up some of the sky. We can edit the brightness. I want to make sure that this is nice and bright compared to the rest of the image. And it'll increase the contrast just a little bit so that the sky is nice and bright. And now when I go ahead and click apply, it'll pop me back into Perfect Layers with my brand new background that is that same blurriness as my foreground. And because these layers are separate, I don't have to worry about the fact that it affected that top layer. So this is really, really useful when you're doing composites inside and out of Lightroom, is you always have access to separating down all of these different image parts. So if I wanted to, I could, for instance, take this and I could bring it into effects and apply an effect to just the top part of my image. Now, when you're ready to go and you're finishing up with your image, and now I want to, let's say I want to edit this in black and white. Before I do that, I want to go down and I want to crop my image again, and I want to make sure that I trim my 2 sky layers. I don't want any excess information from those sky layers. I just want my layer to be one size. So we'll fit to my layer, and we'll go ahead and we'll crop my image down, and go ahead and click apply. It crops my image down. Then I'm going to go up, and if I go up to my layer menu, I want to edit this entire image in black and white. And if I bring it in black and white, it's only going to affect the foreground. Whereas if I go down and I choose New Stamped Layer from my Layer menu, it'll create a composite layer that I can now edit universally. So you go up to the Layer menu and go down to New Stamped Layer. And this means that I always have access to editing my sky layer. If I don't like it, I need to edit the focal point layer because it's a little too harsh, whatever it might be. I will always have access to my underlying layers, but now I can take this entire image into black and white. And because I went through the File and Automate menu, I have access to using all these different modules at once. And this is, again, a very, very nice way of working inside of the library, is I can go in and I can access multiple different modules at once. So here inside Perfect Black and White, I can go in and on the left-hand side, I can apply a specific effect. So we'll open up, for example, we could do the Hollywood portrait category, and I could see what would work in here. So we'll go down and we'll go ahead and select Ambrose, and we'll try that out. It adds kind of a soft glow to the image, which softens pretty much everything at this point. On the right-hand side, I can make some basic edits if I need to. So if I want to edit things like contrast, if I want to go in and maybe lighten up the shadows if they're a little too dark, I can always go in and do that. Underneath, I've got access to a whole bunch of other panes. I've got a glow on this image here, so if I want to add a little bit more of a glow, I can go in and do that to kind of soften the effect a bit more. I can edit my toner. If I want to change the color of the image, if it's a little too intense, I can reduce the effect a bit. I can also go in and use any of my brush tools if I want to, let's say, add a little bit of detail down on the rocks at the bottom of my image. I can select my detail brush, and I'm just going to turn my perfect brush off because I don't really need it for this part. And I'm just going to click and drag over some of these rocks, and it's going to go in and add a little bit of crispness to the edges of the rocks. So once I'm completely done with this image and I've got it in perfect black and white, when I go ahead and click apply and it pops back into layers, you'll see that once again in my layers palette, I've got a brand new layer. I've got just my perfect black and white layer, and underneath is my composite layer. Underneath that is my bride only layer, and then underneath that is my focal point layer of my sky. All of this information has been saved. And when I go ahead and click on save, it's going to pop me back into, it's going to leave me in here, but it's going to save this image and pop it back into Lightroom. So I'll have access to my original image, and I'll have access to this brand new layered format here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and we're just going to close out of this image, and I want to move on and talk to you a little bit about resizing for print. And this is something that can be kind of confusing when you're working with images and you don't necessarily know what to do. I could go in and I could print any one of these images if I want to. And when I'm getting ready for something to print, I know that I want to take it and I want to enlarge it. I want to get this big and I want to be able to print it out at like 16 by 20, or like 20 by 24. I want to print it big, like huge big. I could print it like 40 by 50 big, and so on. So most images, when you put them into Lightroom, if you're getting ready to print, the images are going to be small-ish. They're not going to be very large. So this image getting ready to print is probably going to be close to about an 8 by 10-ish. This is not a very large photo. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and we will Control-click or right-click, go to Edit In, and choose Perfect Resize from here. I'm going to edit a copy of my image because I want to make sure that I always have my original photo. So when I click on Edit, it creates an automatic copy for me that'll now pop into Perfect Resize. Now here inside Resize, on the right-hand side is the document size pane, and this is the most important to pay attention to. This is where you're going to see the size of your original image. First time that you pop it in here. So this photo is 5.5 by 7.7. This is not a very large image. It's got a good resolution of pixels per inch, 300, which is great for printing. However, the size itself is really dinky, and we don't want that. So there are a couple different ways that we can work inside of Perfect Resize. And the first is just through this preset drop-down menu right here in the document size pane. I'll go ahead and click it open, and I've got all these different categories of different sizes. So typically when I go down to the photographic size, you're going to see a lot of stereotypical photo sizes. So 4x5, 5x7, 8x10, 16x20. And just fun fact, all of these different sizes, 4x5, 8x10, 16x20, and so on, are based off of the 4x5 negative, which used to be really popular and actually still is. And so that's where all of those photo sizes come from. Now we shoot at a much longer format. So this is cropped compared to what we typically shoot at. So a lot of times when people crop down to an 8x10 or a 16x20, they get kind of frustrated. And it's because this harks back to the old darkroom days. And these were the sizes that everybody printed because these were the sizes of the negatives. So that's where all these photo sizes come from. But I can go in and I can just choose a new photo size. So let's do 16x20. We'll start kind of smallish. It'll add a crop box to my image because I'm going to have to crop off some of the sides to make sure that this is a certain ratio for my image. So I'll just click and drag my crop box. If I need to, I can change my resolution here. So if I need it to be 360, or if I can drop it down to 250, I'm at a pretty good photo printing resolution size, so I don't need to change anything there. I'm pretty much ready to go. I can sharpen here, or I can sharpen inside Lightroom, and then I'll be ready to print. So this is kind of the baseline resizing. It did all the magic for you. When I click apply, it's going to upsize my image, and I don't have to worry about anything. Now, you also have options to the preset library on the left-hand side. And the preset library allows you to access a certain preset that's specific to printer type and paper size. So if I know that I print on an Epson printer, I typically print on matte paper. I really like matte paper. And matte paper is anything that doesn't have some sort of plasticky coating. So plasticky coating is called resin, and they put it on top of the paper and the ink lays on that resin, and it creates a slightly different effect. When you're working with matte paper, there's absolutely nothing to it except for the pulp of paper. There's no plastic coating, no resin coating on top of it. So I like to use matte paper because I feel like it's a little bit more natural. So we'll go in and I'll just open up this category and I'll select my size from here. So this time we'll do 20x24. We'll go ahead and click on that size. It's going to add a crop box to my image that I can move around if I need to. And then on the right-hand side, this time it applied a baseline amount of sharpening that's specific for matte paper. And matte papers can include a lot of fine art papers. So if you print on a lot of, is it Moab or Hahnemühle papers that are technically matte papers, those fine art papers, those are also going to be under the same category of matte. If you print on anything that has a glossy surface, that's resin coated. And it's a slightly different amount of sharpening that's used for both of these different paper types because they are a little bit different. So it's already applied a baseline amount of sharpening for me. Now I'm good, I'm ready to go. Once I click apply, it's going to resize my image, add that sharpening, and I can print it from Lightroom, Photoshop, wherever I want to print. Now, the last thing that I want to show you here inside of Resize is the tiling feature. So tiling allows you to cut down your image. If you have a small photo, or a large photo, but a small printer. So let's upsize this back to 16x20-ish. 16x20, so it's a nice big image. Let's say you don't have a printer that prints 16x20. What do? The tiling feature basically allows you to cut down your image into smaller sized portions to print out separately and then recombine once they're printed out. So let me turn the tiling feature on here. And what it's doing is it's gone through and you'll see these cyan guidelines and all of these little sections inside these guidelines are 8x10 pieces of paper. So I can print out 2 full 8x10 pieces and then a couple of half pieces here. So this makes it a little bit more manageable for you to print a larger print without having access to a large printer. And you can change the tiling size here. So I've got 16x20. So I could do 4x4 inch squares. And we'll go in and look. Now I've got all these 4x4 inch cyan guidelines. And when I go ahead and click apply, what it does is it takes all of these different sections of your image and separates them into separate files. So you can go through and print each one of these pieces. And then once they're all printed, you can recombine it later. And this is a great way to work if you have maybe a printer that only prints 8x10 and you want to print really big. If you want to print, huge, you're going to have to tile it down, but it can actually be a really cool effect. So the tiling feature can be really fun if you have a smaller printer. So let me go ahead and cancel out of this. And the last thing I want to show you is how to batch process, and then we'll go ahead and get to questions. So when you're creating presets in Side Effects, black and white, if you have a whole bunch of images that you want to apply that preset to, you have the option for batch processing here inside of Lightroom. So go ahead and I'll open up. I have some kind of basic travel photos from around Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, and I want to add some sort of a preset to apply to all of them so that they all look kind of a little bit more universal. They all look like they were shot at the same time. They all have kind of the same filter on them. So to batch process multiple images, all you need to do is select all of those photos. So I'm just holding down the Shift key and we'll click on this photo right here. And I want to process all of these images with the same preset. To do that, I can go up to my File menu and go down to Export. Now here in the Export menu, it seems like kind of a funny place at first, but it does work because what it does is it exports your image to Perfect Effects, Perfect Black and White, Perfect Portrait, Perfect Resize. So whatever you need to export to, you've got that option here. So we'll export to, let's do Perfect Resize because that's where we just were. I can select my category here, whether it be one of my own pre-made categories, or you can choose just Epson Matte. And I want all of these pictures to be exported at, let's say, Epson Matte 11 by 14. We'll go ahead and select that. And I can select where I want my images to be exported to. I can change the name if I need to. I could keep the same name like Beach Drive, resized 11 by 14 print. So you can change your file name, and then once you click on export, it's basically going to take your image into Resize, automatically resize it, pop it back into Lightroom, and do that for each one of the photos that you've selected. So batch processing is a really great way to get things done very quickly. If you know that you want all of your images to be universal, you want them all to look the same or be the same size, batch processing cuts down on how much time you spend inside the program. If you're like me and sometimes you know you need to tweak a couple of the images, I take a few into Perfect Effects or Resize or Black and White and individually add the preset just because I know I might need to tweak it. But for the most part, when I'm working on images for, if I'm doing images for a blog, or I know that I'm going to place images up on Facebook and they all need to be lightened and contrast needs to be added, I can go in and create a preset for one and then export them all so that I don't have to spend the time opening every single one in there. So let me go ahead and cancel out of that. Now, it's just turned 11 o'clock, and it looks like we've had a ton of questions in here, partially because you guys couldn't see my screen at the beginning, which was kind of sucky. So now that you guys can see my screen and you guys can actually hear me, I'm going to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes or so just answering questions. So if there is something that you guys want to know, if there's something that you want to see, if you have any questions about Lightroom or about the photo suite, I'm going to go through and I'll answer as many questions as I possibly can. And I'll go through and try and look at some of the questions at the beginning, but I'm going to be paying a little bit more attention to the ones that have been asked a little bit more recently. So if there was something that you asked at the beginning, I probably unfortunately skipped over it. So feel free to ask those questions now, and I will get to as many as I can. All right, so there was a question about the tiling feature. How would you put it back together? That's completely up to you. So if you really, really like the tiling idea, there are multiple ways that you can do it. I do what's called woodblock transfers. So I print my images out on a special type of paper and then transfer them to wood. And I basically just hang them all separately so that there's a little bit of space in between all of my tiles. You can always do that. If you want there to be no space, you can basically take kind of like gator board or something that you would find at like Home Depot or even like a kid's craft store, and you can just kind of glue them, soft glue them or tape them to the gator board and just line them up together. Now, I typically, when I print out tiles, I like the fact that there's a little bit of a gap in between parts of my photos, so I'm okay hanging them on the wall in separate frames so that there is that gap in between. If you don't like that, you always have the option of kind of putting them back together as closely as you possibly can. So it just that's completely up to you. It looks like there was a question about resolution. resolution dropped to 240 when I upsized to 20 by 24, and is 240 the minimum. When you're printing at larger sizes, it's perfectly okay that you print at a slightly smaller resolution. For the most part, resolution is not as important as people actually think it is. I print images at 180 resolution and they look fantastic. I print images at 360 resolution and they look fantastic. And I print them all at around the same size. I typically print my images from 11 by 14 to 17 by 22. Those are my typical sizes that I print. Mostly because I like 17 by 22 paper. I have a ton of it. So I print at that large size. When you're printing larger, you don't need your resolution to be as large as 360. When you're printing smaller, you don't need your resolution to be 360. If your image dropped down to a 200 resolution, your image is still going to look really great, because it's more important, as far as the image goes, that it's over 180 pixels per inch when you're printing smaller or bigger. It's more important about your printer and how many dots per inch it's actually putting down. That's more important. So the resolution itself is perfectly okay if it drops down to 240. It's not going to hurt your image. And the printer that I use is an Epson 3880, I believe. So I print on it. I've had it for a while. I don't know. They probably have newer printers out that are similar to it, but it's a pretty basic photo printer and it can print 17 by 22 wide. So that's typically what I use. So if one of the things about it looks like there are a lot of questions about the tiling and what it is. When you send your images out to get print by someone else, if you don't know what paper they're using, you can use just a generalized, like, if you know that they're printing on resin coated paper, then just select resin coated. And resin coated is luster, glossy, satin, pearl, any of those words that the companies use, that's all resin coated. So it's all about the same. Matte papers are really specifically called matte papers because they have no pulp on it. So if you're sending your printers out to Costco, Walgreens, CVS, I'm from the West Coast, so I don't necessarily know all the ones that are going to be on the East Coast. You'll know what type of paper they're printing on, so you can use a baseline preset there. And because the tiling outputs multiple files, you'll send, 15 files to Costco to print out all 15 of those pieces. So it separates all of those into separate little images and separate little PSD or TIFF or JPEG files, and then you send them all to whoever's going to be doing all of your printing. There were a lot of questions about whether this integrates into Lightroom 5. Yes, it does. So 7.5 integrates into Lightroom 5. Lightroom 5 integrates into our new suite 7.5. They all work together. So if you guys have the new version of Lightroom, it'll work just fine. So if you're using Perfect Resize, when you hit the OK, does it put it back into Lightroom as a separate image file? Yes, it does. The way that I did it, it will. So if you right-click your image and go to the Edit In menu and choose Perfect Resize, and I'm editing a copy of my image with my Lightroom adjustments, it's going to copy my file and create a brand new image that's upsized. And I always, 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 always do it this way. So that I have my original smaller image and then I have my larger image. And when I go ahead and click apply, it'll pop me straight back into Lightroom with that larger image as a copy of my original. And this is going to be the same for most of the images that you use. So let's see. So it looks like, how do you create a preset for a new type of paper or printing? You can create your own preset just by tweaking on the right-hand side and then saving it as a preset the way that we did in Effects. So, let's say you upsized your image to 16 by 24 instead of 16 by 20, and then you added a specific type of sharpening. And then you added a gallery wrap because you wanted to, gallery wrap your photo. All you need to do is go up to the preset menu and select Save Preset, and you can go in and you can use your own preset from there. So let's see. How would you edit chromatic aberration in the ocean photo? I would always go in and do that here inside of Lightroom. It's the best place to remove chromatic aberration and noise. So if you're in the develop module and you have some chromatic aberration, there's a lens correction dialog here, and all I need to do is just click on remove chromatic aberration and it'll go through and do a pretty good job of doing that for me. And you can also go in and defringe certain colors. So I would always go in and do it here inside of Lightroom first, and then I'd bring it into Perfect Effects. So the chromatic aberration removal tool here is really, really good, and I would suggest using it. So let's see. In Perfect Effects, I did create a lot of layers. Are the cumulative? That is, the modifications are added in each successive layer. So when you create a lot of layers inside of Perfect Effects, those layers are specific to Perfect Effects. So when I go in that first time and I add, 5 effect layers, and I save my image and I'm done with it and I pop it back into Perfect layers, all of those effect layers will get smushed together into one Perfect Effects layer. You won't have access to be able to going back in and editing each one of those layers separately, whether you use Lightroom or whether you use Photoshop. So when I pop it back into Lightroom, it'll save it as long as I have a PSD file, it'll save it as just one Perfect Effects layer. And then if I go back into Perfect Effects, I won't have access to re-editing those later. So you don't have access to going back in and changing any of those layers unless you are immediately inside Perfect Effects before you exit. So let's see. Is Gallery Wrap available in Perfect Resize? Yes, it is. We have a great Gallery Wrap feature inside of Perfect Resize. So if you're interested in doing Gallery Wraps, it is in there. It's the pane on the bottom right-hand side. Is this a non-destructive workflow? We strive our hardest to make sure that it is a non-destructive workflow. That's why I always go through the edit in menu when I was right clicking and it pops up with that little dialog box that asks how you'd like to copy over your image. There's a reason why we do that, and it's so that we don't destroy your original image. And this is something that is really important to most photographers, and I know it's really important to me. I never want to erase my original, even if it is crappy, and even if I don't like it. I always want to know that I can start from scratch. And maybe that's because I'm anal and I like to have access to all of my images, but to me that's really, really, really important. So we strive to make sure that this is a non-destructive workflow. And I typically use PSD files so that I have access to my layer stacks at all time, which is why I never, ever, ever work with JPEGs. Those are destructive. JPEG is a destructive file type, and I always work with PSD files until I'm ready to either print or I'm ready to export to the web. So as long as you're saving with PSDs and you're saving all of your layer information and all of your masking information, it's going to be non-destructive. You'll always have your original image, and then you'll have your second image, which has all of your layer information in there that you can edit if you need to. So let's see. It seems as though TIFF and PSD formats work pretty much the same in the suite. Yes, they do work pretty similarly in the suite. I typically like to do PSD files because they are specific to layers. TIFF files are not specific to using layers. TIFF files are slightly different. So I use PSD files because I am such a layer freak. I also swap in between Lightroom, Photoshop, and the suite. So PSD files work universally. I have access to all of those layers and all of those different programs, or at least I have the ability to make sure that my images are editable with all of that layer information. So I always save it as a PSD file. When I get ready to print, I save it as a TIFF file and I export it as a specific just TIFF only file, and then I get it ready to print, and then JPEGs I use just for the web. But they do work in a slightly similar way. Let's see. What is the best way to remove the halo like around the edge of the rock? The best way to remove the halo is to not edit the image like I edited it. So when I go through and I worked on this image here, let me go to the file, this one. So this halo that happened on the right-hand side was because I went overboard with my tonal contrast. So, which is pretty typical of tonal contrast, is when you go overboard, you get that halo effect. So all I would do is lower my tonal contrast inside the Perfect Effects dialog so that I wouldn't get this halo effect. That's the only reason that that happened, is because I took that tonal contrast and I moved it way too far to the right. And then when I applied the Magic Ocean preset, which has a touch of tonal contrast and a touch of clarity, it added even more, so it enhanced it. So go light on the tonal contrast and you won't get that edge effect. If you do want the tonal contrast in the rocks, let's say, but everywhere else, just use your Perfect brush and just remove that halo with your brush tool. So if you want to go a little overboard with the tonal contrast because you like the way it looks in these rocks, just take your brush tool and brush it out of the sky, and then it'll remove that halo effect for you. If you don't use Photoshop, can you use Photoshop Elements and save it as a PSD? Yes, you can. So Photoshop Elements integrates with the suite now, which is really awesome. So if you're an Elements user, you can actually edit all of your PSD files, all your TIFF files, all your everything. You can do everything in Photoshop Elements. Elements is awesome. So if you have a PSD file, you don't have to worry about it not working inside of Elements, which is really nice. There's a question: why don't you use the Lightroom print module to resize? I don't use it because the algorithm that upsizes the images from a smaller photo to a larger photo make my image look bad. We have a resampling technique inside of Perfect Resize that's specific to Perfect Resize. No one else has a version of it that's even remotely close. We resample your image, but in a way that specifies edge contrast. So we look at the entire image and we figure out where all of the sharp little bits are, all the parts that have detail and are obviously important to the image. And we upsize it, making sure that we add in pixels. Resampling is adding in pixels. We resample the image, paying attention to all of those spots to make sure that we maintain the detail in the image. And the Lightroom print module, if you upsize it all, it upsizes your image, and it does not do a very good job. It doesn't have the same resampling algorithm that we use. You can upsize your image maybe a tiny bit. So maybe a 4x5, you can upsize it to like a 5x7 and it'll be okay. But if you're doing anything larger than that, you're going to want to use Perfect Resize. And this is going to go the same inside of Photoshop as well. If you're printing through Photoshop, you don't ever want to upsize in Photoshop. It looks bad. So we maintain detail and add just enough sharpness so that it still looks like the image is nice and big. Can I use the suite with JPEG files instead of RAW files? Yes, you can. So you can use the suite with any type of file that you really want, pretty much the basic file types. So RAW files, PSD files, TIFF files, JPEGs, you can use PNGs, you can use, I think, large format files. If you're doing large format files, you can do that. So you have access to using tons of different file types and tons of different color spaces as well. So if you're using a specific color space like ProPhoto, you have access to that using the suite as well. So you're not stuck with Adobe RGB or sRGB. You have access to a whole bunch of other color spaces too. Let's see. Why would you sharpen in Lightroom when you're printing? So I sharpen, I'm trying to think where I sharpen. I don't print through Lightroom. I always print through Photoshop. And I typically do specific sharpening. So you can go into the photo suite, into Perfect Effects, and you can apply a sharpening layer that is specific. So I go in and I add a sharpening layer and create a copy so that I have my original image, my edited image, my sharpened image, and then my print image. And I know that there are a lot of you guys who think that that's absolutely absurd, but the reason why I do that is because when you work as a fine art photographer and printer, what happens is if the sharpening is bad and you overwrote your entire image and you don't have your last step, you can't go back and remove that sharpening. So I save a lot of different versions because I go back through and I reprint a lot of my images depending on the edition. So I just had to reprint a whole bunch of photos for a client, and she wanted it to look different. She wanted a little less sharpening. She wanted a softer glow to the image, and she wanted the images larger. So I went back to my second step image, my they're black and white images. So I went back to my original just black and white photo. I re-added some sharpening, but just a small bit, and then I upsized it using Perfect Resize, and then I printed it for her. So I always like to have multiple different file. I like my workflow to be very specific. So I'll always have my original, and then I'll have the second just edited version. So I sharpen using Perfect Effects because there's a sharpening module, and then I can use my Perfect brush and go in and selectively choose which parts I want to be sharper. Like for this image, I don't want the whole thing to be sharp. I want to leave all of this sky out, and I only want to sharpen up the waves and the rocks. So I can go in and I can use that Perfect brush to selectively sharpen. Why would you choose Photoshop over Lightroom for printing? I don't like the Lightroom print module, and it's also partially because I print very large. So I used to work as a fine art printer, and so I printed like large, like 90 inches large, like billboard size large. The printers that I got to use were enormous and took up an entire photo studio. So I've become very accustomed to using the Photoshop print module because I print such strange sizes and I print such large images. So I also work with scanned film, and when you're scanning film, those file sizes, I scan 4x5 film. So when you scan a 4x5 negative, you put it into Photoshop, and then you get it ready to print, upsize it and get it ready to print. That image size is going to be probably double what a typical raw file would be. These photos are huge. So working inside of Lightroom is kind of ridiculous for my workflow. And I like the Photoshop print module a lot better than I like the Lightroom one. Lightroom is what I would use for client images like senior photos. If I was taking senior photos or doing like engagement shoots and they wanted kind of like contact sheets, I'd probably do that through Lightroom, but everything else I do through Photoshop. It looks like there was a question about video from the Canon 7D, as in how you can't edit video using the suite. And I don't know anything about the video editor, if there is a video editor in the new Lightroom. So I'm kind of unaware of any video editing that would come from the 7D into Lightroom or the photo suite. If you're doing video editing, you're probably going to use something called Premiere Elements because you don't have access to doing any of that editing here in Lightroom or the suite.